This is Retro Rambling, an audio podcast discussion about all things retro, with your host, Cyrus Martin.
I have a long history with the Intellivision. If you are a video game connoisseur, then you've probably heard of it at this point, especially with everything that's, modern stuff that's happened. But the original Intellivision, made by Mattel, is a really fascinating console. It's a video game console that came out back in the day, back in 81 that it came out? If I remember that. I think we got it in 83. I think that's when we got our Intellivision. My mom wanted us to have a video game system that was really good, but also had some sort of focus on other things besides just video games, like, educational type stuff, things like that. We were in the early 80s, computers were just becoming this thing that people could get at their home, and they were just starting to have penetration into the, to people's, actual houses where they could have them and do things with them. Personal computers were a new thing back then. And so she had bought us a what she could afford as far as a personal computer was concerned, which was a TRS-80 microcomputer. It's a tiny little computer. It had these little chiclet keys. There was no disk drive. It had 4K of RAM. You could hook it up to a cassette player and record programs that you would hand write on this little thing and do stuff. And that was cool. That'll be another thing that we talk about maybe another time, but the TRS-80 was really interesting. But she was like, it was kind of limited on what it could do with games and stuff. And she was like, yeah, I understand. Because we really wanted a game system. The Atari was the rage. Everyone had the Atari. The Atari was everywhere. All the cool games were on Atari. It was the big thing. So we desperately wanted an Atari, 2600, I think, before it was even known as a 2600. We just called it the Atari. And my mom was like, look, you can have a game console, but I want to have something that's maybe it has more than just games and does something maybe educational and stuff too, which was kind of a downer for us, but we're like, hey, games, whatever, we don't care. So we got Intellivision, and it was expensive back then. It was like $300 for this system. So she got us the Intellivision and several games, and we played the ever-living crap out of it. Me, my brother, and my mom all playing together. And sure, there were plenty of educational games that she got for us, the Math Fun, which I've notoriously mentioned before if you've ever heard me talk about. Word Fun, which was a little more fun than Math Fun, I thought. There was some games that had some kind of educational implement in them. But then there was obviously your arcade, style games that were just really cool. And your platformer games like Pitfall. Pitfall was amazing. Pitfall was we played the crap out of Pitfall. And then we enjoyed, obviously, a lot of other games too, like Astro Smash, Night Stalker, Snafu, the, triple action where you would have the planes or the tanks or the race cars. There was so many games on Intellivision that were so much more advanced than anything else that we had at, a capability of having at our home. So we were really grateful and fascinated to have something like that. So yeah, the Intellivision was really fascinating to us. Canadian Gamer is in the chat. He says, our family did not purchase a computer until 1995, a Packard Bell. Most families did not have a computer until the 90s. That's wow, that 1995. So you got a computer. Did you get a computer when Windows 95 came out? Cause yeah, we, obviously we had some computers that were obviously way before that. We had the TRS-80 thing, and then we had an Apple IIe later. We had that for a long time. We did, a lot of gaming on that later on before we moved on to PC. And when we got into PC, it was before there was even, like, I think Windows 3.0 was out, before 3.1 was even a thing. And back then, Windows was not an operating system like you would think of Windows now. Back then, Windows ran on top of DOS. So you got really terrible performance most of the time running Windows programs. Like, it was notorious. People were like, oh, this is the Windows version. Ugh. They wanted the DOS version and stuff like that. So we've been doing it for a bit. But as far as gaming is concerned, yeah, our initial console was the Intellivision. And the Intellivision is an interesting console because the controllers are hardwired into it. This was sort of something that you saw quite a bit with different game consoles at the time. Not everybody did that. Atari did not do that. Atari had the detachable controllers that you could replace and buy, get a replacement and all that kind of stuff. But the Intellivision controllers were built in. So you were limited on, if you messed up those controllers, that was a problem, right? And you're also limited on the length of the cord. And the Intellivision cord is like this coiled telephone cord style cord. And it's not very long. It's like, I don't know, maybe 3 feet long. It's hard to say because it's coiled exactly how long that cable is, but it's not very long. So generally when you played Intellivision, you were like close to the TV. You were hunkered down, sitting in front of the TV, or you would, set it on the coffee table, which is kind of the setup I have now with my Intellivision. Put it on the coffee table so you can reach it easily and still be able to play it and be comfortable. So the Intellivision is unique in a lot of different ways. The controller, obviously, people, have talked about notoriously. You can see that little placard that I have up there showing an image of sort of what the Intellivision controller looks like. And it's very, very different for a lot of people. And when it came out, joysticks were what everybody was using. Everything was joysticks. Atari, everything else was joysticks. So when Intellivision brought out their controller with a disc control and buttons like a phone thing, and also other buttons on the sides and stuff, it was very different, very, very unique way of doing it. You got to give them credit at Mattel for having the I guess I would say having the courage to try something that different. But this was the Wild West days of video games, right? So everything was different, really, if you think about it. Yeah, the joysticks were prolific at the time, but they hadn't been around that long. So maybe it's not that crazy to think that Intellivision would do something different. And I think that there was versions of the Intellivision that you could buy that actually had a little joystick that would screw into the middle of that disc, and you could use it kind of like a joystick as well. So there were options out there depending on what Intellivision you bought and things like that. Later revisions of the Intellivision, like the Intellivision 2, did have detachable controllers. So I think they figured out that was probably a good thing to do. But the original OG wood grain, big, huge, golden brown Intellivision, which is the ones that we had, and we did have 2 of them. There's a reason for that. Those were, they were what they were. They were very different from everything else. So yeah, yeah, I see you guys talking about all kinds of different things with the DOS. Canadian Gamer, all those DOS games would never run on Windows. Yeah, it was so crazy back then, even when Windows 95 came out, Windows 95 was like this big revolution as far as all that. But yeah, even back then it was like, people were always like, oh, get the DOS version. No, what are you doing? Good times. it was a lot different time back before things were more standardized. Before we had a USB cable, you had to have a cable for everything. You had a printer cable, your keyboard had a cable, the mouse, it had a different cable, every joystick port, everything was its own thing. It was so, the computers were so big. I mean, it's kind of joking here, but you could say like the computers were so big because they had to have so many ports in the back to support everything. That's not really true, but there was a lot of things on the back of a computer that you had to plug in. So many, and I guess you could call that options. I don't know. There's probably a positive way to look at that, but at the time it was pretty crazy. So, Born to Strike says, "Is it true magnets could ruin floppy disk games and stuff?" What are you? Of course, yeah. That's how you. They're all magnetic drives, like magnetic media. Tape is like that. Discs, floppy disks, the 3.5 inch, what was it, the 5 1/4 or whatever the size is. Yeah, whatever size disc, those are written magnetically, and they can erase them magnetically. Absolutely. That was a problem. In fact, the magnets were a problem for more than just the media that you stored the games on. Because if you had speakers, like this is another thing that was pretty aggravating, is like you'd have like a stereo system. You'd like, oh, I'm going to hook this up to the TV and be able to hear the better sound with the stereo hooked up and everything. Well, if you had those big speakers and they weren't magnetically shielded well enough and you had them too close to the TV, they would warp and distort the picture on the screen. And if you left them close to the TV for too long, you could permanently screw up your old school, CRT TV doing that. So yeah, magnets, not necessarily the friend of gaming. Let's just say that. Yeah, good times. Lance says, our first computer was the Timex Sinclair 1000. It had 2K of memory and used cassette tapes for storage. We added a 16K upgrade to it. Yeah, we did the cassette thing for a long time. We had the TRS-80 microcomputer, and we did have a cassette player. It was just a regular cassette player and a cable that adapted it to plug into the computer. And it literally like recorded and played back tones. So when you would like make a program on your computer and you would want to save it to the tape drive, you would literally hit record on the tape, and then I don't remember the command. It's been too many years, but whatever the thing is you told it to, do, it would play all the tones that were required for the computer to be able to read that program off the tape later. And it would just play them out to the cassette player. So then you would have an audio recording of all these tones that would get played back whenever you wanted to load a program off of cassette tape. So you can imagine that process was not exactly fast. That was, it was a way to save things, and you could buy programs that were already pre-recorded on cassette tape, right? That was a huge thing. I know probably more so in Europe than it was in the United States, but it was definitely a thing you could do. I think maybe we did buy a couple of programs that were on cassette tape, but mainly what we did was we would get magazines. They had like these computer magazines, and they would have programs in them, simple little programs, some of them really long, some of them several pages long, but like they would have these programs written out in the magazine for you to try, for you to, put in the computer and try for yourself. You didn't have to do that. You could just write things on your own and see what happened, but these were like really good ways to see what the computer could do and learn how to do it on the computer by actually, looking at these magazines and putting that text into the computer and making it do fun stuff. Like, and we're not talking about like super complicated stuff here. You know, we're talking about like color bars on the screen, or make it play like tones to make it sound like it's doing jingle bells or something. You know, text on the screen that changes colors. Nothing too crazy, but it was so much fun. So we had that, and it was all hooked up to a TV. It was all hooked up to the TV. The computer, I think it just output RF, because the only thing we had on the back of our TV back then was the 2 screws that you had to plug the 2 little, the little clamps into, in order to get a signal on it. There was no coax. There was no composite video. There was no S video. There was no component, obviously, or anything like that. It was just RF. So even when we did our computering at the house, it was, you know, maybe not the best quality video signal you could ever imagine. Yeah. So yeah, we would do our computering that way in the early 80s. But video games were pretty much, we would either go play something at an arcade or at the, local restaurant where they had a game, or convenience store, or grocery store where they had a game, or we would play the Intellivision. And so we got like really, really, really good at some of these old school Intellivision games, which are very simple. Most people by today's standards, obviously, would look at some of these games and just be bored with them very quickly. But this was in the beginning of gaming. And so the experiences were, there was nothing really else that you had available. There was this, or you could go outside and play or read a book, or maybe watch some, show on TV if you had a chance. But we really were, involved in this idea of playing video games. So we would play, and the big game, my mom loved Night Stalker and Astro Smash. In fact, I just had a conversation with her. We were at her house yesterday, hanging out, having a good time. My brother brought over his Oculus Quest, and that was interesting because everybody was really into the VR and having a good time. My niece went nuts playing Beat Saber. Good times. But my mom was like not interested in that. And we started talking about Intellivision and stuff. And I thought, from my memory, I remembered that she was really into Astro Smash from the conversations that we had. And she was like, yeah, I really liked Astro Smash, but I was really interested. She's like, I really liked Night Stalker. And I remembered that we had played it quite a bit, but I thought for some reason Astro Smash was more her favorite. But it wasn't. It was Night Stalker. And the reason is, if you never played Night Stalker, it's probably one of the more complicated games on the Intellivision, because it seems simple, right? You're a little dude running around this maze, but you can pick up these guns that only have a finite number of bullets, and then you have to fight these monsters. There's bats that are hanging around, there's spiders that are hanging around, but the big thing you're fighting are these robots, and these robots generate from the bottom left on the screen, and they will appear. So the more you kill, they just keep coming. And the more you kill, the more of them will come. So you'll have multiple robots coming at you at once, and they'll get smarter, and they'll develop skills. There'll be different style of robots that come at you. And some of them are invisible, and some of them have like shielding, and like, it's pretty cool for back in that time. So there's quite a bit to that. It's only one player, the old school Intellivision version of Night Stalker. But it was so much fun because we were so anxious to see what was next. What's the next robot gonna be that we see? Oh, there's a blue robot. There's a white robot. There's a black robot. Oh my God, look at all these different robots. And then we would see their skills and be like, oh, look how fast that one's going and stuff. So the discovery that was taking place was a huge part of the appeal. And that's kind of like sort of a microcosm of that era of gaming. we were just discovering video games. We were just discovering this new possibility for entertainment. So Night Stalker is sort of like an encapsulation of that entire concept, right? It's super fun because you're learning, you're discovering things. You don't know what's going to happen next. You're under constant threat, and you have to figure it out, right? Because you run out of bullets, and then the gun will like respawn some random place on the map, and you have to figure out how to get to it, and not get like caught up in the different monsters that are hanging around. So very, very fun game. And that's what Intellivision had. It had this uniqueness to it. Yeah, there's Atari that was out at the same time. There was, ColecoVision came out. There was different things that were out there. But Intellivision was maybe a little smarter. Not just that it had educational type games, but maybe there was games on it that you had to think about a little bit more. That might be the case. I don't know. Maybe that's up for debate. But they called it intelligent television, right? Intellivision. And I think that was sort of the thought process with not just the design of the console, but like the style of games that they really put on it. So the Intellivision's a fascinating console if you've never played it. You can actually, if you're interested in learning about this console and learning about the games and stuff, you can get involved in playing Intellivision at a pretty affordable price. So if you go on like eBay, or if you go to your local retro store, you can usually pick up an Intellivision, I think, pretty reasonably priced. The games, for the most part, there are a few of them that are more expensive, but for the most part, the most popular games on Intellivision are very affordable. Maybe $5, $10, nothing too crazy. So like if you wanted to discover what I'm talking about with Night Stalker, you can get that game very cheap, and you can play it on the original hardware. There's also like several different like ways you can play these games with like I have like an Intellivision collection on my Xbox 360, and I have a collection on my PlayStation 2. And they have like ways you can play these Intellivision games like for different things. Game Boy Advance, I think, even has like an Intellivision collection. So there's different ways you can do that. Of course, you can emulate, you can acquire ROMs and do that sort of thing. But if you wanted to actually play the real hardware with the real cartridges, it's not crazily expensive. And I think that's because there's a lot, the Intellivision is a console that a lot of people are just not familiar with, and maybe they don't really think it's that appealing because of, the simplicity of the graphics and things like that. This is an era of gaming that predates the NES, and I think the NES is kind of like a firewall for a lot of people with gaming, right? I think people go, that's as far back as I'm going. Like NES, that's awesome. Everybody loves the NES. I don't know anybody that doesn't like the Nintendo. I mean, look at the thing. But before that, it's you lose a lot of people, and a lot of the people that are willing to go back further than that pretty much gravitate towards Atari, right? Because that's what people know and they're familiar with. They know the name, and there's a whole bunch of like ways to play old Atari stuff that, let's face it, there's not as many ways to play the old Intellivision stuff. There's one flashback console for the Intellivision, which is right up there. And then there's a couple of collections, but for the Atari stuff, come on, there's countless ways you can do that. They have collections on every modern console. They even have the new Atari that's come out not too long ago. So there's a lot of different ways to get involved in Atari. Maybe not as many for Intellivision. So again, I think that sort of factors into it being sort of lesser known, and thankfully has kept the price reasonable. Unlike some other retro consoles that I love, like the TurboGrafx, the Intellivision is a little bit cheaper to get involved in. Canadian Gamer says the NES was the first console we got in 1989. Yeah, I think that's true for a lot of people. a lot of people. There was a lot of people that were doing the Atari thing and all that, but the NES was like the most, I mean, obviously everybody had a Nintendo. It was so predominant that people referred to video games as Nintendo. You know, like, let's go play Nintendo, you know? So Nintendo obviously saved gaming because of the, you know, what happened with all that. And then obviously everybody had one. So Lance says the NES is a starting point for a lot of gamers, similar to Hulk Hogan for wrestling fans. That's an interesting point. Hulk Hogan is the NES of wrestling. I never thought about that. Or maybe it's the other way. NES is the Hulk Hogan of video games. It's a good point. Although there was some controversy with Hulk Hogan in recent years, so maybe that's not, I don't know. You could debate that on your own. I don't know. Yeah. So the Intellivision had games on it that I thought were very special and different. But it also had some games that were very similar to some other things that you saw. One of the biggest games for the Atari and in the arcade at the time was a game called Space Invaders. And I desperately wanted Space Invaders because it was like, you would hear about it all the time. It was well known. Other kids talked about how fun it was. People were always, and I was like, oh my God, I want Space Invaders. Well, the Intellivision did not get Space Invaders. But the Intellivision did get Space Armada. And Space Armada was basically Space Invaders with some upgrades. And again, looking back now, you look back at the quality of the graphics and the sound and the gameplay and stuff, and you go, well, I don't really see this. If you didn't grow up back then, you probably look at these two and think they're basically the same thing. What do you talk about upgrades? I don't see any like upgrades. But for back then, you would see Space Invaders, and then you'd see Space Armada. You see them side by side if you ever did, and there was a perceived upgrade there to graphics, to sound, to gameplay. You know, there was more animation in Space Armada. There was a little bit more variety in Space Armada. It moved a little bit faster than Space Invaders, and you had a lot more options as far as how you could play it and stuff like that. So Space Armada was unique in a way, but it was absolutely sort of a clone of Space Invaders. But I'll tell you what, to this day, I think Space Armada is the better game. But that doesn't take away, obviously, from Space Invaders, because I still love to play Space Invaders now that once I finally got an Atari, which we didn't get till later, it was cool to be able to play the original, Space Invaders. But Space Armada is just an example how sometimes the Intellivision would get a game that was like something you would get on something else. Now, I didn't know about all the games that were on Intellivision. There was a lot of games that came out that I didn't find out until about years later. Some of them I didn't even find out about until the past few years. For instance, I didn't really know that there was a port of Donkey Kong that came out for Intellivision. I had no idea. I knew it had come out for the 2600. Obviously knew it came out for the NES because I have played it a ridiculous amount of, time on the NES. Donkey Kong Classics that has Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr. is an amazing game. There's so much gameplay with that one cartridge. I can't even tell you how many hours I've put into that. Then obviously the arcade and all that, but I mainly have played Donkey Kong on the NES. That's really where I played the most of it. I did have it on the 2600 and I didn't really like it. I thought it was limited and weird. But I'll tell you this, if I thought it was weird on the 2600, it was really strange on the Intellivision. I never knew it came out on Intellivision until, like I said, fairly recently. And when I did finally get to play it, I was very surprised because as most of the time, the Intellivision version of a game that you would see on Intellivision versus Atari Like, for example, Astro Smash versus Astro Blast on the Atari. It looks way, way better on Intellivision and plays better on Intellivision. It's just a better game. The only thing that the Atari version has over it is that it supports the paddle controller, which is actually really cool. But it's a better game on Intellivision. So to see the 2600 version of Donkey Kong and see the Intellivision version of Donkey Kong next to each other, if you've never seen this, go look this up, because the Intellivision Donkey Kong is very strange. Donkey Kong is like this big green blob. I don't really understand what's going on here. The animation's not good. The game is not good. It's not good at all. It's better on the 2600, even though I don't like that version. Most people that I know either prefer it on the NES or the ColecoVision. I never had a ColecoVision, but I know that that version of it is supposed to be really good. The 7800 version is also good, but come on, the NES versions is really, that's where I really like to play it. Joe G says the Donkey Kong port is pretty weird on Intellivision. Coleco sandbagged every version except ColecoVision. Well, that might be what happened. I really don't know the full history of that, but I would not be surprised that it was deliberately gimped on some of these other platforms. Born Distracted says, I didn't find out that Intellivision was a 16-bit console until a few months ago. Yeah, that's something I didn't know, obviously, and didn't believe when I first heard it. I heard it, I don't remember exactly when I heard that, but it had to have been, I guess probably around the time we had like a Genesis and Super Nintendo and all that. I was aware that it was a 16-bit console at that point, which at the time I thought was hilarious, because I was like, how is this possibly 16-bit? We didn't really know what all that meant back then. 8-bit, 16-bit, 32-bit. Obviously, we didn't really know what that meant. It was just like this marketing thing that sort of the kids in the playground would use to, for their little discussions about who had what and what was better. But finding out it was 16-bit was a little bit mind-blowing. Yeah, it definitely doesn't look like what you would expect a 16-bit console to look like, graphically and stuff like that. But again, that goes to what we think of when we hear that term, 16-bit. That terminology stuck in our heads. It absolutely did, and the marketing definitely had an impact on us. So yeah, it just goes to show you how terms like that can really, paint a lot of your thinking and feeling about what the technology actually is, when maybe the terms themselves don't mean as much as you might want them to mean. So, but anyway, even though it is 16-bit, it definitely doesn't look like what I think most people would think a 16-bit system looks like. But I do still say that the Intellivision, for the time, compared to an Atari 2600, usually the Intellivision version looked better and was generally a better game. And it was, I think, for that reason that there was sort of this reaction from Atari because of what was going on with Intellivision. There was a lot of these different consoles that sort of popped up competing with each other. Atari eventually decided to do a 5200. The ColecoVision was there. You had several different things that were popping up. So I think that it was recognized by Atari that they needed to do something to up the game a little bit, because the 2600 was great, but it was a little bit limited. And, the keypad and everything on the Intellivision, I don't know if it, it was an interesting implement. It was something that was unique, and you had the little overlays and stuff like that. And for some games, it was actually pretty cool. But for a lot of games, it wasn't really used that much. But it was interesting to see Atari also include a keypad on the 5200. And then, of course, Coleco had a keypad as well. So there was a lot of experimenting in those days. What's going to work, what's not going to work, nobody really, really knew. And obviously, that didn't get carried over into the future except when Atari put it on the Jaguar, which again, it's questionable whether or not it was really necessary. But yeah, it's just an interesting thing, the keypad on a game controller. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? The jury is still out. All these years later, the jury is still out. Because I know there's people that absolutely detest that think that the keypad is an annoyance and an unnecessary expense and something that didn't have to be there. It complicates things. And then there's some people that really appreciate it and think of it as sort of charming in a way. You know, they're like, I really like this and I love the little inserts, and it makes it seem like because it is so different, it makes it seem more interesting, and it adds something that you don't see on other, video games and stuff like that. So there are some people that absolutely love the keypad. So I'm not going to sit here and say it's, the worst thing ever or the best thing ever, because I know there's a lot of people that have strong opinions on both sides of that. Retro Advisory Board says, talking about the NES, he says it was in so many homes. NES was like the Bill Cosby. Oh, wait, walk it back. Yes. Crazy, how things change. Yeah, it was in a lot of homes. We'll just say that. Ryan says the keypad stinks. The jury is not out. They died years ago. Ryan has a strong take on the keypad for the Intellivision, as a lot of people do. I don't know too many people that have like a middle of the road view of that keypad. I think that most people that I talk to that remember a keypad on a controller, whether it's the 5200 or the Intellivision or ColecoVision or the Jaguar, they have a strong thought about that. There's not too many people that are like, I don't know, I could take it or leave it. You know, most people are like either really for it or really against it. So I definitely understand that. Joe G says, imagine George Plimpton saying Intellivision is a 16-bit console. Do the math. Wow. Yeah, that would be interesting. And Lance says the Intellivision processor was 16-bit. However, the RAM chips were not as advanced to take advantage. Yeah, it technically, that's why it's kind of a silly thing that we like to talk about, because it's technically true that it was 16-bit, but yeah, it's just a fun fact kind of, because we all know if it was what we would think of as a 16-bit console, then it would be able to process things, in a different way. It's like, the TurboGrafx 16, the TurboGrafx 16 technically has an 8-bit processor. And so a lot of people will debate whether it's really a 16-bit console or not. And I sort of just say, yeah, it's 16-bit because it has 16-bit graphics and the games look like 16-bit games. And I think that's sort of how you kind of have to think about these terms, because like I said, 16-bit is more used as sort of a marketing thing or a way to classify a certain type of, certain era of gaming or certain, level of gaming. I don't know, something like that. So yeah. So I wouldn't ever really, yes, Intellivision is 16-bit technically, but I don't think anybody's going to throw it in there with other 16-bit consoles. It's definitely not something like that. So yeah. Retro Advisory Board says 5200 was a direct response to Intellivision. Unfortunately, ColecoVision was just a lot further. Had they waited a little longer, not just rework their 8-bit computers, maybe they'd have had success. Yeah, I know that Atari was a great company with a very interesting history that unfortunately they made a lot of mistakes, which what company didn't? They're obviously Mattel made their share of mistakes with Intellivision. Atari did theirs. Even Nintendo has made their share of mistakes, especially back in that era. The 5200 just did not take off because for one, the 2600 was just, that's what people thought of when they were looking for an Atari. The library was huge. That's what other people had that had Atari. That's what they knew. That was, that was the thing. In fact, the idea of getting like a version of a console, like a new Atari or a new Nintendo or a new whatever, kind of pissed people off back in the day, when Nintendo, I remember when Nintendo announced they were going to do a Super Nintendo, there was an enormous section of the public that owned the NES that was very upset about that, because the Super Nintendo didn't play NES games, and also they didn't even understand why you would need another console when you already had one, and they had already had it in their home. It still worked fine. Why do I need a new one? That sort of thing. People kind of thought of video game consoles as like an appliance, like I don't need a new toaster. My toaster still works fine. Why are you trying to sell me this new toaster? That kind of thing. So I think that also probably hurt the 5200, and when Intellivision did their upgrades as well, I think that was probably a factor in those not being as successful as they could have been as well. But for the time, for that moment when the 2600 was a thing and the Intellivision was a thing, it was a very interesting, unique period for gaming. And having an Intellivision at our house, although it wasn't, super popular where I lived and people didn't know it all that well, anybody I know that came over that played it with us, we had a great time. Whether we were playing a game like Snafu, which was sort of like Tron Light Cycles. I think that game was actually even supposed to be a Tron Light Cycle game, and they for whatever reason, the license didn't work out for that, so they just called it this, Snafu. That game was so fun. Just like getting each other to crash into each other's walls and stuff like that. Or, the different, the triple action game where you did the biplanes or you had the tanks. Just so much fun to be had, with these simple older games back in the day. And of course, how many countless hours I have wasted pouring into Astro Smash, playing that game over and over and over, seeing how far I can get, how high a score I can get. Just, I love Astro Smash. What a great game. And Night Stalker the same. Pitfall was a game that we, as a family, it's revolutionary at the time because platformers were not like a real thing back then. There was no Super Mario, right? So Pitfall was fascinating because you were on this adventure and you didn't know what was next. You would go to the next screen and the next screen and you'd have to hop over the pits that appeared, and you'd have to try not to get eaten by the crocodiles. And then there's these giant scorpions and these snakes and these giant bars of gold and stuff. It's crazy, swinging on the rope. Pitfall was a fascinating, super fun game that, it was so popular. It was on the 2600. It was on the Intellivision. It went on to obviously be extremely successful and well-known all over the world. And I thought the Intellivision version was just amazing. I still love that one the best. That's my favorite version of Pitfall. Lance says Activision had good games on Intellivision. Pitfall, River Raid, yes. I never had River Raid on Intellivision. I did have that on the 2600, and I love it on that. Beam Rider, that's another one I have on Atari. Dreadnought Factor, Happy Trails, Worm Womper, Stampede. Yeah, Activision had a great collection of games back then. And, Activision's gone on to re-release those, and you can play those, in the different Activision collections that are out there. Joe G says Activision was masterful at making the 2600 appear viable. Look at what Champ Games is doing now with Galaga, Mappy, Robotron 2084, etc. homebrews. Astounding. Absolutely. And speaking of homebrews, the Intellivision has got some serious homebrew love, and there are games that are being released for it that I still don't understand how it's even possible that these games can be on Intellivision. There's a version of Super Mario Brothers that's on Intellivision. I don't know if it's out yet, but I've seen the development videos for it, and I cannot believe that they have that game running on Intellivision and looking and sounding as good as it does. Now, does it is it in any way in the same league as the NES version? No, I am not saying that, but just that it can be done on the Intellivision is so fascinating. There's a version of Castlevania called Intellivision, which, again, how's that possible? And I think there's a Mega Man game. So what's happening recently with some of this homebrew stuff? I think they're even doing a version of Zelda for the Intellivision. What's happening is crazy, you know? And I love that there are people that care enough about this original hardware, that care so much about these old school platforms like Intellivision. I love that they're willing to put the time and effort into figuring out how to make these things work, how to like accomplish these miracles with this old school hardware and have it run on the real hardware, and then to put out like a cartridge for it that you can buy. It's nuts. For a fan of retro gaming, and for a fan of the Intellivision specifically, it's really nice to see that other people care that much and can accomplish what they can do to get them running on something like that. It's just really, really cool. CT says, I know, right, Si? Some of the Intellivision homebrews are amazing for as far as pushing the system's hardware. I have about 5. They are kind of pricey, but well worth it for the work that goes into them. So yeah, I mean, you're right. That's one of the things that's prevented me from buying up all these cartridges. I really want them, but I haven't bought any of them yet. And I plan to. I absolutely, hopefully, can get them. Hopefully, they remain available long enough for me to get these cartridges. But they are a little bit more expensive. And I agree with you. When you're talking about an indie developer who's going out on their own and putting that much time and effort into something, I mean, that's an enormous undertaking for an individual who just loves something, who's trying to do something like that, you know? And if they need to charge a certain amount of money to be able to pay for that to even be possible, then that's what they have to charge. And I have no problem with, if it's $60, it's $60. Yeah, we go, oh man, it's $60. I can get like a PS5 game or whatever for that. True. But again, this isn't a completely independent developer who's putting themselves out there, engaging in software development for a platform that doesn't even exist anymore. You got to really appreciate that kind of commitment and support for something that they love, because there's so many other things they could be doing with that time that would be probably better for them as far as their personal career, as far as like monetarily. There's so many things they could probably do with that time that would be, you know, more lucrative for them. And for them to make that decision knowing that, to then still focus on something like making an Intellivision game, I mean, that's amazing. And I applaud people that are willing to do that for Intellivision games, you know, these new games. I've seen them for the TurboGrafx, you know, some people do it for the Genesis, NES. Yeah, if you're somebody out there doing that, you have nothing but my support and encouragement. And I will definitely put my money where my mouth is on that as soon as I can. So, thank you for doing that. Joe G says, Pitfall is probably one of my most is probably one of the most elegantly coded games of the early era. Yeah, Pitfall is amazing. The guy that made Pitfall, I believe, has put out a new game that we were just talking about these games that are being released for the older hardware and stuff like that. And he put out a new game, and it's called like Circus Convoy, I think. And what I watched of that was kind of mind-blowing. Just a really cool new concept and implementation for a game running on old school hardware. So pretty crazy to see what people are still able to do nowadays and are willing to do. And yeah, Pitfall, yeah, just a very well made game, obviously. Lance says, I think Activision also owned the iMagic IPs. Not sure if this is still the case. Intellivision's Keith Robinson's made a deal with them to get the iMagic games on Intellivision Rock CD collection. Oh wow, that's interesting. There's some awesome iMagic games, absolutely. John Durbin says, I hope Sewer Sam comes out reimagined on Amico and the remix of Pop Goes the Weasel. Well, so let me finish off my discussion of the Intellivision by mentioning the Amico, because I think that it would be kind of silly to not mention it. Whatever your opinions are about that console, it is a new Intellivision console. The company has been resurrected, and there's a new Intellivision console that is in the works and will be coming out in the not too distant future. The new Intellivision console is at some point going to have the old school Intellivision collection. I don't know how much of it. We'll end up seeing how many of these old school games end up actually being available on the new Amico, Intellivision Amico. But so a lot of these older games will end up on that new system. But one of the things that I think is really cool about this new system is that it's going to have new versions of some of these older games, like retro reimagined, versions of the old school Intellivision games. Some of the games that we love in my family more than anything else. There's a new Night Stalker. There's a new Astro Smash. There's a new Snafu. There's the Biplanes is back, skiing. There's a bunch of these old school Intellivision games that have they're being like completely remade from the ground up with new graphics and gameplay and stuff, music, everything. And some of them are just really impressive. If you're an Intellivision fan who grew up with Intellivision, you see these new versions of these games. They're kind of mind-blowing. I've played several of them. I actually have had that opportunity. And so getting it at, in my home, being able to share that with my family is something I look forward to. As much as I look forward to sharing many new experiences that are a throwback to what I grew up with and what we originally fell in love with in the world of video games. So, Intellivision, kind of a weird console, right? A console that a lot of people don't know much about, or maybe don't really understand that well because they never used the disc controller on it, and they'd never played some of these games on Intellivision. So kind of a console a lot of people aren't that familiar with. But I think it's definitely a console worth celebrating, and even today, I think can be a lot of fun. So hopefully you've enjoyed some of this discussion about the original Intellivision. I just want to jump in here real quick. This is Cyrus from 2023. What you've been listening to is Cyrus from 2021. So, unfortunately, if you're looking forward to the Intellivision Amico, I would probably say the odds of it actually getting released at this point are probably very, 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 very small. Yes, I did get to play prototype versions of it, and back when I did this podcast, I was very excited about it for a lot of reasons, because obviously I'm a huge fan of Intellivision, but it just didn't work out. If maybe someday, somehow, some way, there is some way that there could be a release of a new Intellivision, I don't think it would be the Amico. I think the Amico ship has sailed. There's the company is wrought with controversy and with problems. There have been massive issues that have taken place with the individuals that work at the company and for the company. It's just a mess. It's probably not going to be released. I don't have any ill will towards anybody. I don't have anything bad to say about anybody that still believes there's a chance that it could be released and is holding out hope for something like that. I actually find that, I sympathize with that, is what I'll say, because, yeah, I'm a huge fan of the console myself, of the original Intellivision, and I did enjoy what I played of the prototype games and the things that were shown to a bunch of us. But, as they say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? And maybe not even good intentions sometimes, right? We don't know everything that's happened with the console or the company. We're never going to know. It's a mess. It's a cluster F. So yeah, I would not expect, if you're looking forward to getting an Amico, that you will ever get one. And I would not encourage anybody to pay too much more attention to anything that happens with the console or the company, unless you're somebody who's trying to recover your investment money or your pre-order money. I wish you luck with all of that. I hope that things work out for you if you happen to be caught up in this. And if you're following the ongoing controversies and drama involved in the Amico stuff, good for you. Do what you think is right the way you think. That's up to you. It's not up to me to tell anybody what to think or do. But I have moved on. I have definitely moved on. So I don't talk about this particular console anymore. I don't associate with the people that work at the company anymore. I don't even know for sure what exactly went on at the time that I thought I did. So, but my friends, I still have a whole bunch of friends who have varying opinions about all of this stuff, and I'm still friends with my friends. We all have to make up our own minds and do what we think is right. So that's what I'm doing. So I just wanted to jump in and add some updated context to this discussion, since I don't really talk about the Amico anymore. And like I said, I don't listen to podcasts about the Amico. I don't watch videos about the Amico, and I don't encourage you to do that either, because it's a waste of time. And it's just about a bunch of drama these days anyway. But like I said, if you happen to be somebody who's trying to recover assets, good luck to you. I definitely wish you luck. I hope that you're able to do that. Everybody else, that's all I got to say, and we'll finish out this podcast now. This will be, as I continue to do episodes of the show, we'll talk about a variety of different things, different retro game things, computers, TV shows, movies, toys, comic books. There's so many awesome things from the past that are worth talking about, worth remembering, and have relevance for today, because some of these things are, they have a massive impact on, even modern things that are coming out, or some of these things are having new versions brought out of them, new reimagined versions or sequels or different things like that. So there's so many reasons to talk about retro other than just to, put on the old rose-colored nostalgia glasses and remember the good old days. Retro is relevant in today's entertainment world as much as anything else is. So thank you guys for joining me for the chat. Thank you for joining me for this broadcast and recording session for Retro Rambling. If you're interested in this podcast, you can absolutely subscribe to it on a variety of different services. We're now on iTunes, Google, Amazon, several different services that are out there. And of course, the episodes will still be uploaded to my YouTube channel, which is where I'm doing this live version right now. So if you want to get in on another live recording and have your thoughts added to the chat and, you know, possibly part of the show itself, you're more than welcome to do that. We don't get into drama on this. We just talk about cool retro stuff. So thank you guys in the chat. CT, Born Distracted, Retro Advisory Board, Lance Jennings, one of my favorite names to say. John W. Durbin, Joe G. I think the Retro Bro was here earlier. I saw him pop in. Videodrome 80. Ryan Landis, one of my other favorite names to say, Ryan Landis. Ty Lord Stevenson. There's so many awesome names you guys have. Canadian Gamer, good buddy. I appreciate him being here and his support. Thank you very much. There are so many cool people that have popped in. If I missed you, if I didn't say your name there, I apologize. But I definitely appreciate your support and your thoughts. So I will see you guys again soon. But for now, this is Retro Rambling. I'm Cyrus Martin, and I will talk to you later. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you for checking out Retro Rambling, an audio podcast discussion about all things retro. If you enjoyed it, then check back soon for more. See you next time.